Doctor Who is a show we all learn from. Over the years, it has taught us many things: to be kind, caring and resilient, to be brave and stand up for what we believe in. Doctor Who has taught us most of all to be accepting and open to others. Even the branding for the latest series, using the slogan "Space for All," carries this message of inclusivity. But is the show really as inclusive as it's made out to be? Is the show in fact doing the opposite of this by misrepresenting certain groups and being even downright discriminatory at times? Well, join me as I take a look at the history of transgender representation in Doctor Who. First off, we're going to need to understand what it means to be transgender. This may seem slightly confusing to some of you, as it's a term most people are familiar with, but the definition can be easily misconstrued and twisted, so I'd just like to set the record straight. We're going to start off by determining the difference between sex and gender, because these are also easily confused and are very important things to understand. Biological sex can be determined by your anatomy and chromosomes, for example male and female, as well as intersex, which is a result of an alternative chromosome development. Gender identity, however, is who you are and how you feel, a defined personal conception of oneself. There are many gender identities that a person can identify themselves with, which are all valid identities that deserve equal respect. A transgender person is simply someone whose gender identity doesn't align with their biological sex. For example, I am a biological male, I was born male and I have XY chromosomes, but I identify as a woman, therefore I am transgender. A cisgender person is someone whose gender identity does align with their birth sex. For example, if someone is biologically male and they identify as a man, they are cisgender. The words trans and cis are both prefixes that derive from Latin, trans meaning on the other side of and cis meaning on the same side of. In short, a transgender person is someone whose biological sex doesn't align with their gender identity. Dysphoria is a term that describes the sense of unease that a trans person may have because of the difference between their biological sex and their gender identity. A trans person can alleviate their dysphoria by transitioning. Transitioning is the process that some may undergo to change the way others perceive them. This can involve changing a person's overall presentation, their name, their pronouns. Transitioning varies from person to person and there's no specific goal to it. It's simply a process to alter your external appearance to match how you feel on the inside. Being transgender isn't easy, it's an incredibly challenging experience. Transgender people face discrimination on a daily basis all over the world. It's also going to be important to this video to understand what transphobia is. Transphobia is a dislike or prejudice against trans people. A microaggression is a statement, action or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle or unintentional discrimination. Transphobia can take many forms and isn't just a direct use of slurs, it can also be seen in these microaggressions. Transphobia can be many things such as misgendering, deadnaming, assault, targeted harassment, the loss of basic human rights, and overall failure to respect a transgender identity. Being transgender is not a phase, it's not a trend, it's not a joke, it's not a fetish, it's not a choice, and most of all, it's not something a person should be treated any different for. However, being transgender is something to be proud of. It's something that deserves respect and validation from everyone. Being transgender is how a person is born and nothing can change that. So with that in mind, onto the main point of the video. With our now rigid definition of what it means to be transgender and now being able to recognise transphobia, I asked the question, is Doctor Who transphobic? In short, no, of course it isn't. But again, we're going to have to take a deeper look to properly answer that question. Side note, I'm not going to be talking about any writers, actors, or members of the production team who have voiced their negative views on transgenderism. They are simply horrible people who are not worth drawing attention to. So, what makes good representation? There are four main aspects as to what makes a good representation. Firstly, it must be realistic. It's important to have an accurate representation that avoids stereotypes and makes sure the character isn't defined solely by their trans identity. It must also be considerate. Is the representation carrying a good message? Is it aware of the issues surrounding the topic at hand? What is the message that the narrative is carrying? It must also be explicit. Does the character in question explicitly state their identity and their experiences? And finally, it must be respectful. Is the character's identity respected by the narrative? Is the correct terminology used? It's important to make sure the characters don't fall into any negative and potentially offensive stereotypes. And with what we now know to be a good criteria, let's take a look at the transgender representation in Doctor Who. Russell T Davies was responsible for the revival of Doctor Who in 2005. In many ways, his first series in the role of showrunner was one of the most progressive, but one of his most infamous returning characters within the first two series is Cassandra. Cassandra is explicitly the first transgender Doctor Who character. Now before you all start throwing insults at me in the comments, which to be honest you've probably all done already, I would like to acknowledge the ongoing debate about Cassandra's identity. A part of her character is constantly getting facts about the human race wrong, as she is the last human alive and has been around for a very long time. But a certain scene reveals her transgender identity where she tells the other characters in the episode of her past.
Home will die. That's where I used to live when I was a little boy, down there.
Now, it's never explicitly stated if she's being sincere in this scene, or it's just part of the running gag, so Cassandra could potentially be interpreted as transgender from this line. Russell T Davies hasn't said anything else about this, but in a book released only months later, it was supported by further evidence. So I'm going to say that Cassandra is trans. I mean, it seems to be the most common consensus among fans, and is probably what Russell T Davies had intended. So let's say that Cassandra is the first transgender Doctor Who character. This is the very first example of transgender representation in the show, and it's horrible. Let's take a look at Cassandra's character. She's narcissistic and vain, she's obsessed with surgeries, she's butchered her body beyond the point of recognition as a human, and she's seen by everybody as, and I quote, lipstick and skin. These are all heavily offensive MTF transgender stereotypes. It's a common misconception and stereotype that trans women all have had extensive surgery to appear hyper-feminine, and this may be true in some circumstances, but it's only due to the way the rest of the world treats them. Unfortunately, due to gender roles and stereotypes, before transitioning, a trans woman may not have much of a chance to present themselves as stereotypically feminine as possible, due to such things like the aforementioned stereotypes and toxic masculinity. So when a trans woman does come out, they will more likely present themselves as stereotypically feminine as possible. So when a trans woman does come out, they will more likely present themselves as stereotypically feminine as possible because they never had the opportunity to do that before in life. And that's okay. Well, it's not okay that the stereotypes got in the way, but trans people should be free to express themselves however they please, but it's seen as such a negative thing within the story. Another reason that trans people may have surgery, again not extensively because many people may choose not to have any medical treatment at all for their transition, which is once again absolutely fine. But the reason that many trans people have surgery is due to unrealistic and once again negative cis-normative stereotypes getting in the way. Again, it's up to a person as to how they want to present themselves, but it's all been shaped by these unrealistic beauty standards and stereotypes. So once again, it's a shame that this aspect of Cassandra's character is villainised, as it's an uncontrollable part of a trans person's identity as to how they present themselves. It's almost in the story as if the characters are attacking and vilifying Cassandra because she's had surgery to make her feel more comfortable in her own body. But again, it's an unrealistic exaggeration of a transition. No trans person wants to end up as a piece of skin stretched over a frame. It's stupid and offensive. Now, it's easy to dismiss these aspects as part of her character, but as the first trans character in the show, it's really not looking great. And it doesn't end there. The character returns at the beginning of the next series and is represented, dare I say, even worse. Cassandra's motives in New Earth are to transfer her mind into another person's body, which is every transgender person's dream. So it's slightly confusing when she takes over the Doctor's body and gives this reaction.
Goodness me, I'm a man. Young. So many parts.
Not a single trans woman would ever react like that after years of extensive transitioning. In fact, if a trans woman was placed in a man's body, it's unimaginable how negative their reaction would be. It would be very unlikely that a trans person would celebrate being put back into the body of the sex they have spent years of their life escaping from. This is an awful example of transgender representation. It's not realistic, it's not considerate, it's not explicit, and it's not respectful. Cassandra is some of the worst representation I've ever seen, and in case you bring up the argument that Cassandra isn't explicitly trans, don't worry, we've got more. Bethany Black is the first trans actor to appear in Doctor Who. Well, in fact, she's the first transgender actor to play a transgender role on British television ever, having been cast in Russell T Davies' 2005 series Banana and Cucumber, that follows the lives of queer youth in Manchester. Sleep No More from Series 9 of Doctor Who features Bethany Black playing the role of 474. Again, the role isn't explicitly trans, but the actor is. And this misrepresentation is somehow even worse than Cassandra. Like we did before, let's take a look at 474's character. She's a mindless brute who has little to no intelligence and barely has any lines apart from grunts and limited vocabulary. She's grown to react to any attack, and if this wasn't bad enough, she constantly sexually harasses her crewmate despite him making it very clear he's uncomfortable with it. In one scene, she even violently retaliates at being rejected by him.
Chopra pretty.
Oh, for the gods. Just back off.
This is simply disgusting. These are once again negative transgender stereotypes that are usually used as transphobic arguments. The fact that the character was grown and was a medical experiment seems to back up the argument that trans people are ruining their bodies by going on hormone replacement therapy. TERFs, that's trans exclusionary radical feminists, will often use the argument that trans women are violent sexual predators. This is of course not true, but the way these scenes play out, it highly reinforces the argument. Now, I'm not saying that Mark Gatiss is a raging transphobe. He was probably blissfully unaware of who was going to be playing the role at the time of writing the character. It's just really not going to look great if the first trans actor in Doctor who he was responsible for writing for, falls into all the negative and offensive stereotypes. Once again, referring back to our checklist, it's not realistic, considerate, explicit, or respectful. It's a real shame, as this is a revolutionary moment for the show, and a great opportunity to represent such an already misrepresented minority. But it's just a waste considering we haven't had a transgender actor or character in the main show since. Now, so far, I've only spoken about large roles and characters within certain stories. This isn't to say that there isn't misrepresentation elsewhere. I'm going to divert to the popular Doctor Who spin-off show, Torchwood. Now, as far as queer representation goes, Torchwood does a pretty good job from the outside with queer identities and sexualities. Greeks Bearing Gifts is the 7th episode in the first series. This episode was penned by Toby Whithouse and is one of the best episodes for queer representation in the show from my personal standpoint. However, it contains what is possibly the most disgustingly blatant transphobic monologue that I've heard on British TV.
Friend of mine, let's call him Vincent, starts acting strange. And we've got to start calling him Vanessa.
This is just downright offensive. I honestly don't know where to start with this. It covers so many examples of transphobia that I listed earlier. In these 6 sentences alone, Jack manages to misgender, deadname, alienate, and fail to respect the trans person in question. This is so odd to see from such an openly queer time-travelling character who should be used to this sort of stuff. Let's pick apart exactly what he said wrong here.
Friend of mine, let's call him Vincent.
First of all, he deadnames the character. Deadnaming is the use of a transgender person's former name. Deadnaming may be accidental, but can also be used purposefully to dismiss a trans person's identity, and is extremely hurtful, which is exactly what's going on here. If that wasn't bad enough, Jack proceeds to misgender the character by using the incorrect pronouns and referring to them as a regular guy. This is also extremely offensive and dismissive of an identity. He then says that, and I quote, "we have to start calling him Vanessa." The words "have to" imply that it's almost a chore for him, like he doesn't want to do it. He also says that, "since then I've always been a little nervous when a friend behaves out of character." This makes it seem like he's afraid of transgender people, like we're something to be scared of. It's up for debate as to whether Toby Whithouse is intentionally transphobic within the script, and yes, I'm saying scripts as plural due to that awful joke in A Town Called Mercy, and I say the word joke in heavy quotation marks.
He's called Joshua.
No, he isn't. He's called Susan, and he wants you to respect his life choices.
These instances go to show that a trans person doesn't have to be directly portrayed within the show to be misrepresented. Imagine what sort of impression these scenes alone would set into someone's mind of what it means to be transgender. I feel like the criteria isn't even worth referring to on this one. So many people's impressions of what transgender people are like is shaped by the media, so it could be detrimental to the public perception of the trans community if we are continually misrepresented like we are in Doctor Who. Doctor Who's transgender representation seems to be a lot stronger within the expanded media, especially the big finished audio dramas, having many queer and trans characters and actors in the stories themselves. Early last year, Big Finish released the first series of the current 8th Doctor adventures. This box set was entitled Stranded, and features the first ever transgender Doctor Who companion. Rebecca Root played the role of Tania Bell fantastically in the series. The most important part of Tanya's character is that she's normal. She's just a normal person within the plot and not an over-exaggerated negative stereotype. She serves firstly as a great companion to the Doctor and romantic partner to Liv, but also as some pretty stable queer representation. It's probably important to share why this character means so much to me. All my life I had felt wrong, like there was something off and I couldn't figure out what it was. I knew inside that I was a girl, but couldn't find the words to articulate what I was feeling. I haven't had an extensive education of or even basic understanding of what transgenderism was, due to the lack of information I'd been given and the misrepresentation I'd seen in the media. At the point when I first heard this audio, I was in a difficult position. I was confused about my identity whilst also feeling uncomfortable in my own skin. The one thing I needed was a good example or influence that would better my understanding of what exactly was going on inside my head. Now, I'm not entirely crediting Doctor Who for being the one who made me fully realise who I was. I had many other things to help me out along the way, most of which were songs and albums that carried a similar message as to what I was feeling. But Doctor Who was certainly the one to break the ice open to the doors of me understanding who I was. There are plenty of fantastic moments with Tanya in the first box set. I've heard that there are more within the second that I'm still yet to hear. But there is one specific scene that particularly stuck with me. Tanya's coming out scene is beautiful. It's not exaggerated, it's not misinformative, it's not offensive, nor is it a bad representation of what's going on. It's simply one of the most beautiful moments I've ever heard in a single audio drama.
Do you fancy going for dinner sometime?
Dinner? As in, like, a date?
Well, yeah. There is one thing I should say, though. Just in case.
No.
I mean, I don't want to put you off, but I kind of have to tell you.
Right.
I'm trans. I'm transgender.
Right.
I just thought you ought to know.
When I first heard this, I cried. For the record, I had never cried at a movie or a book or a song or anything up to this point, but I just did, and I didn't know why. And then it hit me. I am transgender. This thing that I've heard so much about, but have been too afraid to identify myself with, that is me. I am feeling exactly what this character is, and at first, it made me scared, but I soon felt accepted and like I had a place once I realised that this character and I were so alike. I had seen myself accurately represented in the media for the first time, and it just felt good. Some of you may be asking, why does it matter? It's only a character. Well, representation is so important to give us an accurate depiction of a real-world issue that needs a lot of respect and care surrounding it. Further education can better people's understanding of a topic and help them to grow as people and learn to respectfully support those, such as transgender people, who aren't treated fairly and deserve all the love and respect that they get. If Tania were written differently, I could be a very different person. At a point where I was so crucially figuring out my identity, if something like this had been mistreated, I could have gone down a completely different path. Tania Bell is a realistic, considerate, explicit, and respectful representation of transgenderism. It's pretty safe to say that Doctor Who hasn't had the best history with transgender representation. In fact, far from it. But thanks to characters like Tania Bell, we can hope that this is a starting point for more influential and representative characters to be written that inspire future viewers to recognise what it means to be transgender and how to respect a trans person's identity. I'm writing this on the 1st of June, which I'm sure you're all aware is Pride Month. There is a reason Pride exists, and it's not because of selfishness or any other reason that a bigot may suggest. It's because of all the pain and discrimination that queer people face. Despite people constantly trying to put us down, we are proud of who we are, and we are certainly not going to let anyone take it away from us. To anyone who's watching who isn't a part of the LGBTQIA community, it is your duty to be a good ally and respect those around you. Be respectful of others' privacy and identities. You don't have to fully understand someone to be accepting of them. It takes absolutely nothing to be kind, and it means so much to be accepted. And to anybody watching this who is a part of the LGBTQIA community, you are loved. You are so strong for being yourself, and you should be proud of who you are. You are you, and you shouldn't let anybody take that away from you. I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel and like, or even share this video. It would really mean a lot. Thank you all for watching, and happy Pride Month.